Well, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all, and thank you for all the help that many of you have already provided for Holly in this campaign to end this terrible, terrible injustice. Thank you all, and many of you here have done all kinds of nice things we don't even know about, but thank you so much. But I think the first applause I would ask you to give is to the two bravest women I know who are here today, Holly Gregg and Mum Ann. Well, thank you all, and your support has meant so much to Holly and Anne, I can tell you. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Little things like Albert and the T-shirts, and Holly's now got two, not just one, but two songs written for her. One by a man who's in the audience today, Alan Helm, and another one by Chris Moffat. So well, there we are. Thank you, Alan. That was great. Anyway, we haven't got too much time, and obviously many of you do know the story, so I'll try to condense it as quickly as I possibly can. Just to begin with, if those of you don't know it, in 2000, Anne's daughter Holly revealed to her that, and Holly was 20 at the time, that she'd been sexually abused from the age of 6, starting with her father, then her brother, and then another group of people, another 14 members of a paedophile ring. This was all revealed in 2000, and the members within that ring included social workers, yes, nurses, head teacher, accountant, police officers, fire officers, and a sheriff, which in England and Wales and Northern Ireland is a judge equivalent, so there's a judge involved in there. Shortly after all these names were revealed, this is another thing that will not surprise many of you, 11 days afterwards, Anne was snatched from her home by what we can call a hit squad from the local mental hospital, dragged away from Holly and injected publicly right in front of people outside her home, leaving Holly in great distress. And Anne was taken away to the institution, Cornhill Hospital in Aberdeen, and she was held there for several days. Fortunately, I'm going to flatter Anne a little bit here. She was smart enough to find her way out pretty quickly. And what she did was to go to her solicitor, a lady called Yvonne McKenna, and Miss McKenna said, you must have yourself checked by a proper top analyst, and that is what Anne did. She went to a Dr. Ellen Smith, asked Dr. Smith to analyse her with all the tests, use all the skills to find out whether she was sane or anything, or all those sort of things. And Dr. Smith found there was nothing seriously wrong with Anne at all. She was perfectly sane, despite the fact that the doctor at Cornhill Hospital, who was in charge of Anne's abduction, an abduction it was, decided that she was schizophrenic. Further, a little bit later down the line, when Dr. Smith had prepared her report, indeed, even the Dr. Alistair Palin had to concede there was nothing whatsoever wrong with Anne.
Just hold it just down a bit.
Oh. Right, hear me better now. Now, when this occurred, obviously it was very, very difficult to find any information out at all, and Anne's solicitor, suspecting that the abduction had indeed been unlawful, asked the Scottish Mental Welfare Commission, who oversee all these things, for documents showing who actually authorised Anne's abduction, because you can't just, even in this country, you're not supposed to just drag people from their homes and put them in a mental institution without good reason. And that document has to be signed by at least one JP. However, within less than 2 months after Anne had been abducted, the Scottish Mental Welfare Commission, I do have the letter, wrote back to Anne's solicitors, said it had no documents whatsoever relating to the case. None. To this day, we are trying to get an independent investigation into this one with all the other things we're doing, but on top of everything else, we're trying to get an investigation instituted into this particular issue alone. And the head of the Mental Welfare Commission now, Dr. Donald Lyons, he wasn't there in 2000, but he has looked through, he's examined the case and can find no reason why a public inquiry should take place. No reason. Anne, unlawfully abducted. Holly they tried to put Holly back to her abuser father, but Dr. Lyons decides that he can't find anything wrong with the case at all, nothing at all that should be investigated. Now, obviously, after 2000, things became even more awful for Anne and Holly, because Holly had mentioned that about the death of Anne's brother, Roy, Holly's uncle, of course. Now, on the night of the 17th of November 1997, 3 years before Holly revealed the terrible things that had happened to her, Roy Gregg was found in a little village, or not a village, but a little side road to the north of Aberdeen, in an area that he never normally went to, in a stationary car, having been burnt to death. Now, no one could really understand why this would happen. Roy was a popular man. He was a bachelor. He was 53. He was a bar manager. Everybody knew him. He was as a good-natured man. He had no relationship worries. He had no health worries. He had no financial worries. There was absolutely no reason why he should take his life, as the police and the authorities led the people to believe. Roy's death was designated as death by smoke inhalation. That's on his death certificate. But the family were baffled by this. They could find no reason why this should happen. And in fact, it occurred just 6 days before Holly's 18th birthday. And Roy was absolutely devoted to his wonderful niece. And he planned the party and he brought a beautiful bracelet for her and everything like that. But 6 days before, he was suddenly found dead in mysterious circumstances. Then what made things all the more suspicious is the family could not get hold of the copy of the autopsy. The Crown Office in Scotland, who control these things, refused to hand over the autopsy and continued to refuse all that. And that went on and on and on. And we, in fact, only got the autopsy, which I will tell you about in a little while, on the 31st of December 2009. 12 years of trying to get hold of this document. So there we had a situation that was really awful. And, of course, what was discovered later was, of course, that Uncle Roy had actually accidentally walked into the home, Anne and Holly's home, and found that Holly's father abusing her. So, although nobody knew a motive for murder at the time, in 2001 we certainly did. But nothing happened. The Scottish government, or the Crown Office, that controls all these things, and the police made no effort, no meaningful effort whatsoever to investigate either the abuses or the murder of Roy Gregg. This went on and on and on. Don't forget, there's a police officer involved in the murder, and that police officer is a senior forensic officer who we believe may well have been on duty. We're not sure yet, because we haven't been able to get hold of the records, but believe he may have well been on duty on the night that Roy Gregg was burned to death. So we have all those things going on. Now, obviously, to try and keep things as sort of short as possible, as swiftly as possible, is that going up to the present time, we'll move from sort of 2000, 2001 until now, apart from one thing, interesting point that I would make. Now, of course, the police didn't conduct any proper investigation, despite the fact they had 16 different perpetrators named, and Holly had also named 2 other child victims that she'd seen being abused. That was in 2000, but nothing whatsoever happened, not a thing. No meaningful investigation took place at all, as has been admitted by the police. However, the case itself was really blocked by the Procurator Fiscal at that time in Scotland, a lady called Eilish Angelini, who has consequently come to be the head of really all the legal prosecutions in Scotland. She is now the Lord Advocate, member of the Scottish Government, and who I will demonstrate in a little while know all about this case. what I will tell you is that the Scottish Government, we've talked about people who know things and cover things up and turn a blind eye to, but in this case, the Scottish Government, led by Alex Salmond, actually not only know about this case, they know about the mass rapes of children, they know about Anne being thrown into a mental institution, they know about the cover-up of, for the murder of Roy Gregg, but still they do absolutely nothing, and in fact actively support this. And the way they've actively supported it, in one respect, is my arrest on the 12th of February 2009. As some of you will know, with all the efforts we did to try and break the story through the media, in which there's been obviously a great deal of pressure from high up, especially on the BBC, to block the story after they spent 6 weeks researching it, and were very happy with everything that we had given them, all the documentary evidence that Anne had most painstakingly kept, and Holly's statements and everything else, they were forced to drop it just at the last minute. And we still haven't found out, or they still haven't admitted who actually stopped them from broadcasting it. But we know for sure that it was the Lord Advocate herself. And I also know it was the Lord Advocate personally who ordered my arrest and being charged earlier on this year. So we have a member of the Scottish Government actually actively abusing her position to actually prevent the course of justice, to pervert the course of justice, and to actually try to silence anybody who happens to stand in the way of that and is prepared to speak up. So we have a terrible situation here in which we actually have a government who are protecting child rapists. There's no other question about that. One of the little things, it's a very serious thing, we also had great difficulty in getting Holly's medical notes. These, for some reason, Anne couldn't get hold of, but through persistence, we managed to get hold of those only about 5-6 months ago, when obviously we were well into the case by that time, because obviously I've been working with Anne and Holly since the beginning of 2009. And when we received the documents of Holly's medical records, the story became even more sickening and horrifying than we thought it was even at that time. Holly, don't forget, told her mum about the abuse in 2000, and she'd been abused since 1986, or around 1986. However, when we received the medical records for Holly, we discovered 2 documents there. The first was dated in 1990, and this confirmed that Holly, aged 9, had been given a sexually transmitted disease. 9 years old, Holly, with Down syndrome, had received a sexually transmitted disease. Obviously, at risk, something should have been done. In 1992, the same doctor wrote again about Holly's conduct in the school classroom, pelvic thrusting, consistent with having sexual experience when she was 11. Still, nothing happened. Anne was never told about it. Nothing happened whatsoever. And we believe that the police had all those documents when Anne first made her complaint against the rape gang. So all of this, you can imagine what happened. Holly had to suffer 10 years of misery. In 1990, had it been brought to the attention of the authorities in the proper way, then all this 10 years of misery for Holly could have been prevented. The doctor concerned, who wrote the report, is one of the very few professionals to come out of this terrible, terrible case with any credit whatsoever. And his name, he's actually not very far from here. He's an English doctor who was working in Scotland at the time. His name is Dr. Paul Carter, and he actually works in Warsaw. Now, the letter that he wrote was to Anne's GP, a Dr. James Maitland, who is most definitely not one of the people who comes out of this case with any credit whatsoever. And it was also forwarded on to we understand, to the headmaster of the school, who is also named as a member of the rape gang. So 2 of the crucial people involved, we don't know about the doctor, about his involvement in any sexual misdemeanors at all, but we do know that he actually failed to pass on the information. When I spoke to Dr. Carter, first of all, as soon as I'd received the medical documents, I have to say he was terribly shocked about it, and he got rather distressed and said, oh, really, I should have done more about it, I should have done more. But I said, well, Dr. Carter, I don't think so. I don't think you should blame yourself for this. You did absolutely the right thing. You made the correct analysis as you thought fit, an honest analysis, and you passed it on to people who should have been responsible for dealing with this matter. It wasn't for you to know that they were really either paedophiles or part of the covering up for the paedophile ring. That's not reasonable for you to think that you've done the best that you can. And he told me that he'd left Scotland shortly after 1992 to come back down to England and just assumed that the case was being dealt with in the proper way through the authorities, as one would have expected. But that was obviously not the case. So we have this terrible backlog going back for over 20 years when this gang should finally have been brought to justice. And don't forget, even after 2000, no doubt they still carried on, knowing that they were quite safe from prosecution and that they had the support of the authorities. One of the interesting points is that the sheriff concerned, whose name I can't mention because of my bail conditions, but nearly everybody knows who it is, and he's all over the internet, and you can see his picture on the internet as well. You can see all that, yes, I didn't say it, but maybe somebody else might say it. But the sheriff concerned was a close associate of Elise Angelini, and apparently remains so. Now, in 2009, after the case had been allegedly examined again by the police, it was once again Mrs. Angelini who had blocked the case in 2000, who ended up blocking it again in 2009. How do I know this for sure? It's because I actually phoned up the Crown Office in Edinburgh, which Mrs. Angelini is in charge of. She's in charge of everything in Scotland, all the crimes. It's up to her whether people get prosecuted or charged or what. I mean, certainly she's responsible for me getting arrested and charged, but not rapists and killers, apparently. However, with Mrs. Angelini, I managed, after a sort of considerable effort, I managed to get through on the 18th of December to one of Mrs. Angelini's key assistants, a lawyer called Catherine Harper, who is in charge of the department dealing with sexual abuse. And after persistent questioning, at the time I was pretty sure that Mrs. Harper would put the telephone down on me, but she didn't. And in the end, I kept saying to her, who is responsible? Who is responsible for dropping this case in 2009? You dropped in the case in 2000, and we know who's responsible. Who dropped the case in 2009? And in the end, she whispered, the Lord Advocate. I said, good, thank you. That's exactly who I thought it was. But trying to get anything out is very, very difficult. Now, what I should say is I really want to, in the time that I have, I'd just like to establish to you how we know, how we can prove that the Scottish Government are directly responsible for this terrible cover-up, and in fact, doing more than that. Because when Mrs. Angelini was first challenged by me over this in the summer of 2009, she had a letter written to me by a man called Andrew McIntyre, who's the head of Victims and Diversity at Mrs. Angelini's office in Edinburgh. And in it, he said that, stipulated that Mrs. Angelini wasn't in situ at the time that the case was reported, and that she knew nothing about it, and therefore had no connection with the case whatsoever. However, Mrs. Angelini took office on the 21st of July 2000, which is a matter of public record, and the bulk of the people in the paedophile ring were named by Holly and Anne on the 25th of August 2000. So, in fact, Mrs. Angelini had been in situ for, albeit just over a month at the time when the bulk of the names were reported, including the name of her close associate, the sheriff. So I said to Mr. McIntyre, I said, well, I think you're wrong there, Mr. McIntyre, because chronologically you're out of order here. Mr. McIntyre wasn't quite sure what to say, but what he did say was that, well, the only thing I can think of is that it was dealt with by other people in the Procurator Fiscal's office, that they perhaps didn't pass on the information to Mrs. Angelini. So I said, well, I think that's most implausible, Mr. McIntyre, because this is one of the most serious cases one can possibly imagine. Unless Aberdeen is actually the crime capital of the whole world, surely they're not going to keep this vital information about this terrible case from the boss herself, especially considering some of the people who are involved in the gang, one of them being a close associate of hers. So anyway, Mr. McIntyre was embarrassed about this, as well he might be. And he said, well, that's all I can think of. I really can't think of anything else to say. So I had something else, actually, that would compromise him, or compromise the Lord Advocate even further. And I said I actually have a letter here dated the 27th of October 2000. And the letter comes from Anne and Holly's Scottish parliamentary representative, Brian Adam, MSP, 27th of October 2000, over 3 months after Mrs. Angelini took office, and the letter which I have, and which is actually on the internet and anybody can see it, is directly addressed to Mrs. Angelini, including the paragraph that says, just asking her what progress she has made on the case. But Mrs. Angelini, of course, reckons she didn't know anything about this. We have a further document as well that proves Mrs. Angelini's guilt in this case, and we actually have a letter dated the 12th of July 2001, almost a year after she took office, from the Procurator Fiscal's office, and quite boldly emblazoned across the top of it is Procurator Fiscal Elisha Angelini. And the letter is directly sent to Anne's solicitor at the time, Yvonne McKenna, actually discussing areas to do with the case. And this is the case that Mrs. Angelini, who is one of the, should be in one of the most high-profile and most trustworthy offices in Scotland, claims to know nothing about, wasn't involved, had no involvement whatsoever. She is a liar. She's lied over and over again. I sent all this documentation to Alex Salmond, the First Minister, last summer, and demanded that she be dismissed, and that the very least that should happen was that a public independent inquiry should be opened. So Mr. Salmond and members of his government have had all this documentation for all this time, and they know about it. Now, I'm going to carry on now about a bit more evidence, and it is really awful, about the death of Roy Gregg. As eventually, when we persisted in trying to get the autopsy, we were blocked at every turn, and the previous assistants had tried to get it without any luck at all. And when we persisted, we were told by the Crown Office that control this document that they did have a copy of it, but they didn't really want to send it to it because it was not their custom to do so. In fact, what their custom was apparently, so they said, was they would get a doctor, they would appoint a doctor to come on the telephone and ring Anne up and interpret what the autopsy meant, because Anne might not understand it, I might not understand it, so they're going to have a doctor, their own appointee, to come on and explain what was in the autopsy, just so that we could be clear about how Roy Gregg died. Well, we weren't having that, were we? Because we said to them, no, we want the autopsy. And if we're not sure about anything, because we're not qualified to make a judgment, we will get a doctor of our own. We'll find somebody who will explain it to us, somebody totally independent who will explain everything there is about the autopsy. The autopsy arrived on the 31st of December, just over 3 weeks after Angelini had again blocked the case. And in the autopsy, it was terribly distressing. It was found that Roy had suffered skull damage, he suffered 2 broken ribs and a broken sternum, and yet the cause of his death was described as smoke inhalation. There was also quite a considerable quantity of brown liquid in his stomach, almost certainly thought to be whiskey. Now, not only was Roy, although he was a bar manager, he wasn't really much of a drinker, a very moderate drinker, and unlike most Scotsmen, he hated whiskey. He would never drink whiskey. So, after receiving the autopsy, before doing anything else, I decided to canvass a little bit of opinion from people who did know what they were talking about, sent them copies of it, as did some of the very brave people in Scotland who've been really working very, very hard behind the scenes to actually expose this. And they're very brave. You have to be very brave in a kind of a near-fascist state of Scotland, that's for sure. But we canvassed a bit of opinion. We spoke to a few medical people, 1 or 2 retired pathologists, and we gave them the details on the autopsy without telling them about the motive for murder that we knew about. And incidentally, I should just say that when Holly's father was caught with Holly by her uncle, it was just 2 to 3 weeks prior, it's estimated around 2 to 3 weeks prior to Roy's death. So it's quite clear that he was killed to silence him because of what he knew, and that it would bring the whole ring down. Anyway, I asked for opinions on the autopsy without divulging details of the motive, and the general opinion, we talked about 6 people altogether, was that Roy Gregg had been, in fact, badly beaten, had whiskey poured down his throat and thrown into a burning vehicle. That is how they all agreed that he died. Now, I then rang up the the specialist, the pathologist, the senior pathologist who performed the autopsy. As again, his name I'm precluded from mentioning, but you can find him if you really want to. And I called him and I said to him, Doctor, can you remember doing the autopsy on the death of Roy Gregg on the 17th of November 1997? And he said that he did, and he thought it was quite a, you know, they put a lot of thought into it and all the rest of it. And I then said to him, I said, but you've actually decided that no proper inquiry was needed in this. Foul play wasn't suspected. It's been portrayed as if it was an unexplained death, but probably suicide. I'm a bit puzzled that you came to that conclusion. And whereas I don't want to get into a detailed discussion with an expert like you on a subject of which I know nothing, I have been talking to quite a few people who do know what they're talking about. And one thing that they said to me, even before knowing about the motive, which I had divulged to them just a few minutes before, is that very, very few people ever commit suicide by fire. It's too painful. The only people who tend to do this tend to be political activists or people who've got a very disturbed background, and neither of these conditions applied to Roy Gregg. Generally, when a case like this occurs, it's usually foul play, murder by arson. Arson, of course, used frequently to cover up other crimes and destroy evidence. So why didn't you suggest a full investigation? Why not in this case? You have to say that statistically, and I think the chance of somebody committing suicide by fire is, I've heard since, is about 0.01%. So it's a 99.99% that Roy's death was a murder. But you didn't treat it like that, and neither did the police. I also asked him, I also named the forensic officer who was part of the rape gang, and asked if the doctor knew him. Well, of course, you would expect him to know him if in that line of work, and he said yes, he knew him quite well. And I said to him, could you tell me if he had any involvement whatsoever in the inquiry when Roy Gregg was found dead? Was he on duty at that time? Was he called in to deal with it as he's a senior forensics officer? And the doctor didn't know. He said, oh, I can't remember. Right. By this time, he was getting a little bit panicky. And he said to me, he said, well, Mr. Green, he said, it sounds as if you're trying to implicate me in all this. So I said, Doctor, implicate you in all what? And he said, oh, nothing. He said, whatever it is you're trying to suggest, I'm not part of it. It's not me, I'm not part of it. So he said, I just made conducted the autopsy in the normal way, and I wrote down what I thought fit. And I said, well, what you've done on this one doesn't seem to, by any shape, by any stretch of the imagination, seem to be a reasonable conclusion. Everyone thinks that it's murder. It's very odd that you, as a recognised expert in your field, didn't feel the same way. So obviously the conversation didn't last very much longer, but obviously I think we pretty well proved our point on that one. And I have to say that even now, since I was arrested and since our adversaries have started to make attacks on me, on a document prepared by the sheriff's lawyers, they've actually referred to the death of Roy Gregg as a murder on an official court document. Not an alleged murder, not murder, inverted commas, anything like that, just murder. They've referred to it as a murder. So even the other side now believe that Roy Gregg was murdered. Obviously, there are quite a few things that are quite interesting connected with this, and this, I'll take you up to the time when I was arrested and questioned. Now, what we do know, what we're pretty sure that we know, is the name of one of the murderers. And we believe that this was effectively a contract job. We don't think it was one of the gang, although it could involve the gang, but more likely than not, it was a contract job. And it probably involved more than one person because of the circumstances. Now, when I was being interrogated by the police after being arrested in Aberdeen on the 12th of February, the two officers concerned, D.S. Drummond and D.C. Crowder, were present. And D.S. Drummond, who led the questioning, started to ask me about various things. One of the questions that came up very early, or one of the things that I mentioned very early on, as it was recorded and could be used in evidence against me, as they put it, I had said to them, right, who ordered my arrest? Who was it who ordered my arrest today? I said, was it you personally, or was it somebody else? And he wouldn't answer it, first of all. I said, come on. I said, I think I have a right to know. I've been deprived of my freedom for no good reason that I can possibly see here, and I would like to know who was responsible for that decision. Was it from your own volition, or was it someone else? Anyway, DS Drummond got a bit nervous about this, and he sort of mumbled, oh, well, he said, it was a team effort involving the Crown Office. I said, really? I said, would you like to name the members of this team? Of course, that more or less shut DS Drummond up. He sort of looked anxiously at the other officer, and the other officer looked anxiously back at him. And then they decided to go on to a very mundane question to follow up, nothing whatsoever to do with this line of questioning. So the interview went on, and I threw in another situation which I knew would make things very, very difficult for them. And it came at the time when DS Drummond said, Mr. Green, what sort of, about your email address, do you use... Give me the name of your email address that you normally use, and I gave it to him. And he said, do you use any other email address, any other address that you might use? And I said, yes, there is one. I said, I'll tell you what it is, but I use it very, very rarely indeed. And in fact, the last time I used this one was to contact the person I believe was involved in the murder of Robert David Gregg, Roy Gregg. And they said, what? I said, yes, I've contacted that person. And I told, I'm not going to mention the name now because it might prejudice things a little bit further down the line, but I gave the name of the person I believed was involved in the murder. I told them where he lived, who he worked for, and what his position was. And it's in the Aberdeen area, I will tell you that. So, again, the officers sort of looked a little bit askance at this, and again changed the subject very rapidly to another more innocuous line of questioning. So, anyway, what happened was, of course, I was released on the 15th of February on bail and charged with breach of the peace, which was backdated to the 9th of June 2009, by the way. According to the police, I've been breaking the law since the 9th of June 2009. Nobody had said anything about it to me until the 12th of February 2010. Just around the time that I decided to stand for election, in the general election for the constituency of Aberdeen South on the Holly Gregg issue in order to bring it into the public domain. So suddenly, walking just off the main street in Aberdeen with my bag, which I've got with me today, and some papers in it, the Aberdeen police decided that I should be treated as a criminal, arrested and charged. Not that mass child rape or raping of people with learning disabilities or murder in the most horrific circumstances, that doesn't seem to count for very much in Scotland. That's not all that serious as far as the police in Aberdeen are concerned. But walking just off Union Street peacefully is a very serious crime as far as they're concerned. Right, thank you very much. I've just got a few minutes left to say, but what I would just say is that we are making some progress in all sorts of different ways. Very quickly, just going a little bit away from the original subject, but people have been threatened over this case, people who want to help, and in particular, I would just mention the Down Syndrome Association. People were talking about the NSPCC earlier on. The Down Syndrome Association initially gave full support to our campaign. They knew full well that people with Down syndrome and with other learning difficulties were being regularly used for sexual purposes, were being abused all over the UK, and they were really anxious that they would give 100% support for Holly, because they said, Holly Gregg's case is one that we've got to win for everybody's concern, for the sake of all the people who are being abused. And they were quite well aware that all sorts of authorities were going to all sorts of lengths to cover up this case. So we had 100% support. And this support lasted for about 6 or 7 months. Until towards the end of October, when things were getting very hot for the opposition, I received a call from a very good man called John Smithies, the press officer, and John said to me, Robert, can I talk to you for a minute? I've got to go and see the Chief Executive Officer, Carol Boyes, on Monday. She's very concerned about the Holly Gregg story. And I said, well, in what way? He said, well, all I've done, he said, I've just put it around in the internal documents within the Down Syndrome Association. I've not published it outside, but I just wanted to check with you, first, if anybody's taken any legal action against you, because you've publicised this for a long time and you've named people and all the rest of it. Anything happened to you? And I said, no, John, not a thing. And no one else has been prosecuted. It's been, some of the things have been put in the papers in different ways, but nothing's happened to anybody at that time. So he said, oh, well, right. He said, but I'm a bit worried about this interview. Anyway, I called him on Tuesday, and he told me then that he'd been sacked by the chief executive, Carol Boyes, who happens to be a lawyer, and the grounds on which he was sacked was that his attempts to support, his support for us over the Holly Gregg case might lead the Down Syndrome Association to face legal action. And on that basis, he was sacked. I was very angry about this. John was nervous about it because he'd been told that he should win his case if he took it to tribunal, but he was told by his legal advisor not to speak to me, even though I offered my support, and I knew Anne would support him as well if it was required that we came to speak on his behalf as witnesses. But that is the situation. He has now... so I went after Carol Boyes. Of course, she played a dead bat, wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't answer my emails, until I did get one eventually saying, Mr. Green, this is none of your business, more or less, and I'm not even going to discuss the matter with you. But Carol Boyes has let down the people who she's paid to represent. She has let them down. She has betrayed their interests. And I've been saying for some time now that she should be dismissed. And I know there's a gentleman here in the audience, Grenville there, who's taking steps to actually try and make this come to fruition by trying to go for an extraordinary general meeting. Thank you, Grenville. And let us hope that that takes place before too long. Just before I finish speaking, I'll just mention one other development as well that we're working on at the moment. The big thing, of course, is the general election. And obviously, it's still a possibility that I might be able to stand, even though my bail conditions preclude me from entering Aberdeenshire, so I can't even go and talk to anybody. But there's still a possibility that I might be able to stand, although it is difficult because one has to get 10 people to support you publicly who are voters in that particular constituency. And I have to say, you've got to be a pretty brave person to put your head above water in Scotland generally, and Aberdeen in particular, because of the level of corruption that pervades all levels of the service in Aberdeen. Police, doctors, social services, judiciary, lawyers, the lot. It must be one of the most corrupt cities anywhere in Western Europe, in my opinion. So I'll try and stand if I can. But we are taking steps with Anne's own MP, called Owen Paterson. He's a Conservative MP. Not that politics got anything to do with this, because this case kind of upsets everybody. It doesn't matter what spectrum you belong to, your views are politically. Everybody is appalled by the molestation of children. But Mr. Paterson has been, was approached by one of Anne's fellow constituents. He's done nothing at all for Anne in the past. He wouldn't even respond when I took up the case to try and ask him for some help. But he has now said in a letter, which we have, is that he met Anne several times in 2007 and 2008. And he's been working behind the scenes to try and help. Mr. Paterson, you are a liar, and we're going to make sure that everybody in your constituency knows you're a liar. And in my opinion, you don't deserve a single vote if that's the way you treat someone in your constituency as being so cruelly dealt with in such a horrible way, and you haven't even got the guts to stand up for them, and when you're put on the spot, you lie about it. So, Mr. Paterson, you should go. And I don't care who replaces you, you should be kicked out, in my opinion. So, almost at the end, there's so many other things that I would like to say, but I will just mention one thing about how awful things are in this country, as if you don't know by now. And I noticed that Raisa there is from the Ukraine, and she will know about this, Raisa. I've mentioned this before. Now, what the Scottish Government are doing are covering up for these horrendous crimes. But I mentioned to the police, actually, that there was a man that Raisa will know called Lavrenti Beria, who was the head of the secret police in Stalin's regime. And what Lavrenti Beria did for his pleasure was to have little girls, schoolgirls, dragged off the streets of Moscow so that he could do whatever he wanted with them, knowing that he had the full support of Joseph Stalin himself, so nothing would happen to him. That's right, isn't it, Raisa? Yes. Now, we thought nothing like that could ever happen in Britain, did we? We thought not possible for that. But yes, we have. Because in Scotland, there is a sheriff, a judge, who has had children delivered to him for years and years and years, knowing that nothing could happen to him because he has the support of the Scottish government. That is how bad it is. And we have the same Scottish government, led by Alex Salmond, who are trying to prevent the prosecution and even the investigation of a man who passed on a sexually transmitted disease to a 9-year-old girl with Down syndrome. That is what we've got. It's part of our country. And I'm out for one. I'm absolutely ashamed that we have such people and such things going on in our country. We've got to use this general election, in my opinion, to make the care and protection of our children a key factor. Because you can talk about, as I think earlier on Jack mentioned, people talk about national insurance and everything. If we can't, as a nation, if we can't protect our children, our most vulnerable members of society, from these terrible, terrible crimes, then we haven't got a country fit to live in my opinion. So
Thank Robert very much for that. There's more to the story because he spent time banged up at the police, and one of the brilliant things that happened was phone calls from, we believe, thousands of people resulted in the Grampian police switchboard closing down. They just didn't know what to do. And this started to show us people power, which I'd like to talk to you about. So I'm going to thank Robert. Now, can I interrupt?